Okay, so I'm going to talk about policy in this new economic order. And I know that for a lot of people that can sound quite boring. I know as well if you're thinking, if when you're reflecting on many of the things that you've heard the last few days, you think, well, you know, many of these things happen spontaneously, so why bother with something like policy? And the reason is, I think, that a lot of what you hear in these types of conferences is very, very different. If you think about something which is a crowd-funded application on a Bitcoin ledger, and then you look at Uber, these are entirely different economic activities. We nonetheless believe there's something similar, something common in there, and I think it's the job of policymakers to try and identify what that commonality is, and to elevate it, to make sure that it has some strong common good in it. So, given that I was also billed as somebody that's going to talk about the breakthrough, let me do that as well. I think these slides are not the final slides that I gave you, so I'm going to have to explain this slightly out of order. What I was going to explain, and the slide will come up later, is if you look at something like open source software, if you look to something like the period 2007-2008, we were adding something like 60 million lines of open source code a year to the overall open source code base. About 240 million lines of open source code altogether. If you look past the crisis, you find that right now there's something in the region of 30 to 40 billion lines of open source code. And we're adding, on average, about 5 billion lines a year. So when you start to think about breakthrough, if you want one metric of this breakthrough, it's actually this community that's been growing for the past 30 years, and which is now the linchpin of most large enterprises. There is hardly a large enterprise out there that doesn't depend completely on open source software. And that figure of 5 billion code lines a year, I think, is the best metric of this is really, really a collaborative economy with structure and with purpose. You do have to set it against the background of change that's going on more generally, and that's the purpose of this slide, just to illustrate that actually we are in a period where the kind of dynamism of the last 30 years is fading. So if you look at the last 30 years, what's really driven the global economy is the development of very complex supply chains. That idea that we in the West can outsource the manufacture of many of the goods that we consume and elevate the kind of economies that we've been interacting with. That idea is coming to an end. Its effectiveness is coming to an end. So what you see, for example, is that China now wants to add value. If China wants to add value, global trade actually declines because it sources internally. So something's going on in that area that we can now confidently say the old economy is stalling and probably will decline. And that's the green line that you see there. That green line is from an IMF study. Officially, we may be into some kind of secular stagnation. But if you look at what people do almost spontaneously, what they do with their lives, that what they do is import and export data all day long. So if you look at the figures for data transmission across borders, it's growing at something like 50% a year. So we have trade 2.4% and declining. We have data flows at 50% and increasing. And part of that is things like when you search on Google, you export your data to Google. Or when you download a white paper from DBS in Singapore, you're importing data from Singapore. So we have massive amounts of trade going on, and these are sometimes community-based. If you think back to Bill's presentation a couple of days ago, the SAP Community Network, nearly 3 million people now cooperate on that network, constantly importing and exporting, trading ideas, IP, on how the next generation of IT software might be implemented. The problem is it has no monetary footprint. So the kind of metrics that we use to gauge whether our economies are growing or not growing, or to understand how we create value, simply don't work anymore. They work for that old global supply chain context. There are other areas where our collective activities create value that we don't actually measure. If you look at the table on the left here, that's taken from the Forbes, the world's most valuable brands list. It's number 11 to number 20. So you get Disney, BMW, and Intel, these types of companies. On the right is a list that I created with a company I work with called Stat Social, where we looked at social affinity. So what we did was we looked at brands that actually have people persistently share elements of their content across different social networks. So Facebook, blogs, Google+, all the rest of it. And if you start to measure that activity, which in effect is a crowd activity, it's our social interaction online, then you see that companies like GitHub, Lonely Planet, which is hardly born social, but is a very social brand, Etsy, Android, of course, Pinterest, they have affinity at the same kind of level that a Coca-Cola has. The difference being that to be in the list on the left, you have to spend billions every year. And because you spend billions every year, you're allowed to put billions onto your balance sheet, billions of assets in intangible values. You're not allowed to do that from my list. But I would argue that my list is a far more accurate reflection of the kind of value that we're creating. It's just that we're not spending billions creating it. We're creating it through our social activity. So in many ways, we are creating huge amounts of value that we're simply not measuring. What we're also doing, I think, is pushing elements of the economy away from large companies towards smaller companies. And that's partly a function of the kind of platforms that we have heard about over the last few days. So if you look at the number of companies who are going to generate 40% or more of their revenues outside their home countries, that's going to increase by about 66% over the next 3 years. If you look at companies operating, small companies operating in 6 countries or more, that's going to increase by 129%. So there's a massive increase in this new economy in the capacity of smaller companies to act like large companies, small companies to act like born social, but also born global. And part of the reason for that is the rise of business platforms. And we hear the term platform a lot. We don't define it particularly well. But if you go back to the kind of origins of the modern business platform, then you can say it's something like Apple or Google. It's Apple and its developers community, it's Google and the search community, Google and advertising, these kind of two-sided markets which companies like Uber and Airbnb have perfected. In perfecting those platforms, that we have also changed the technology base of the platform economy. So now you can create these platforms extremely quickly, you can scale them extremely quickly, and you can scale them to an unprecedented degree. So last year on the 11th of November, Alibaba managed 80,000 transactions per second. So we are now operating businesses at a level of scale that is totally unprecedented and probably unimaginable. And that's the power of the platform. These kind of platform ideas are now being developed in the area of integrated platforms. So if you look at something like GHX, it's a platform for trading in healthcare. And the assumption behind that is we no longer need bilateral relationships. What we need are platforms where we can collectively go and conduct all the business we need without actually sending a salesperson on the road to do the selling. These platforms are growing in sophistication, so you have a payment layer. Alibaba grew up with a payment layer. It grew up with an escrow service, so it's always been a financial institution. We're seeing companies like Ariba now adding that payment layer, but also a lending layer. So these platforms are actually becoming more complex financial institutions using the data that we saw earlier on. That massive growth of data is allowing these platforms to extend into things like lending. And no doubt they'll soon be into more and more sophisticated services like foreign exchange and some kind of currency management and hedging. So the thing that we're talking about in terms of the sharing economy, there it is. That's the slide I wanted to start with. So I'll just go past that. The thing we're talking about in the sharing economy, I think, is I think it's a double-edged sword, and everybody knows it. So you hear people talk about the gig economy. You look at something like Uber and Amazon Local, which are highly extractive. They're taking money out of local economies all the time. But they are very, very efficient, and they're efficient beyond anything we've ever seen in any industry, in any company, anywhere. But when you look at something like Apple, it now owns 95% of profits in the smartphone industry. 50% of companies in consumer electronics are stressed, financially stressed, because all the money is going to smartphones, and in smartphones, most of the profits going to Apple. And in that environment also, we know that work becomes much more peace-like. It's how many rides you do for Uber, it's how many people you get into your Airbnb, which creates ambiguity around welfare. It's neither right nor wrong, but it creates ambiguity in systems that have served us relatively well for the past 50 years. So those are the types of, I'm now going to have to go through slides I created a week or so ago and try and pick out the areas where I think we need to focus. So I think that when you look at what policymakers need to do, you really do need to start thinking that actually the big issue is not whether we have privacy or not have privacy around data. That is an issue. The issue is we are actually creating wholly new economic systems through that data that we're neither measuring nor managing nor using to serve the community. Because by and large, what platforms do is polarize society. And I think that there needs to be ways to counter that kind of polarization. I think as well that people need skilling for functioning in the ecosystem. I've been a freelancer for about 30 years, and I've never found it easy. And even though I've published in various journals and published books and written for Forbes, I still find it difficult. Being in the ecosystem is a very tough place to be because we're not trained to be there. We're not trained to design our lives around the kind of options that you need to simultaneously manage to survive out there. And I think businesses also need that education. In the last 3 minutes, I'll probably stray over a little bit. If you go back a few years, there was a Nobel Prize-winning author, Elinor Ostrom, and I don't know if anybody's heard of Ostrom's work, but she focused mostly on what she called the common pool resource. And by that, she meant things like fisheries. If you have a lake around a community, around a lake with a forest in the background, the chances are that common pool asset is best managed by the people that live there. So she was arguing that most management of most resources is best managed by the people most affected by them. And beyond that, the best thing that you can say is that authority should always be layered. There should be layers of authority and layers of opinion on how resources get managed. I think what we're lacking today, and in fact you can see the evidence of this here in Brussels. If you look at the fisheries policy, the fact that we've centralized fishing policy is responsible to some extent for the fact that we're running out of fish. And if you leave responsibility with people who are affected by that kind of resource, then you will manage that resource well. And we tried to do that about 20 years ago with things like the Creative Commons. So under Creative Commons, we said, let's not try and be too selfish with our content. Let's not worry too much about peer review. Let's put it out there. Let's give it away. And I think in some sense it's been disastrous because now we all have an opinion and none of us know how to validate opinion particularly well. But at least we tried and we had the debate and we had a new policy come out the other end of it. I think we need to start defining these ecosystems as common pool resources. If I go searching on Google, it's demonstrable that most of us don't care about the privacy issue. But we know that the courts now care about that. What we don't know is whether we can use that activity to create new policies around how we create wealth through our common activities. And if we can identify how we create that wealth, how can we distribute it more fairly? Because at the moment what we have is a system where we freely export huge amounts of value without any reward to anybody other than the fact that you find what it is you were looking for. I think that goes for things like Uber and Airbnb. These systems create data. The kind of trading platforms that are out there create data, and that data has value. And if you listen to the vendor relationship community, it says, actually, in all these cases, you own the data. It's your data. The reality is that the data has value because it's our data. There are many, many, many of us creating that data. So in a city like Brussels, isn't it valid to say that the data created by the city of Brussels in the use of something like Uber or Google or Airbnb or any other platform, in some sense, at some level, at some layer, belongs to the city of Brussels, should be used for the city of Brussels, and the kind of value that's created from it should be diverted at some level back to the city of Brussels or back to the nation of Belgium or wherever it might be. I'm sure that a lot of people would find that a relatively controversial idea because, you know, we say we should not interfere with the way companies like Google or Uber or Airbnb conduct their business. But I think if you look at the initial slides, then what you should also realize is at the moment, we are simply exporting value. We are giving it away. We are engaged in trade. We're doing all the things that we used to do with goods, but we're doing it with IP and data, and we're getting absolutely nothing back from it as a society. Hence, I think we need to stop talking about crowd and start talking about common pool value. Okay, a bit out of order, but that's my message for the crowdsourcing community.
Great. Thank you, Haydn. Thank you very much.